Good morning, everybody. Yeah, you got to give it up for the Detransitioners. We got Identity Crisis, a big documentary coming out. This is a super important topic. I'm very honored to get to come out and moderate this panel. What we're facing really is an identity crisis that's being foisted on our culture, on our society, on our children in particular, and we're going to put a very personal touch on that. I want to open up just by talking a little bit about how serious this crisis is and kind of where it's coming from. I'll quote actually from, as I do, you guys saw me yesterday, I quote from the academic literature very frequently, and I want to tell you about a queer theorist in education. This is a guy that writes academic papers and books. His name is Kevin Kumashiro, and he has a paper that he wrote a number of years ago where he explains that the purpose of bringing queer theory into education, which they call queer education, queer pedagogy, the purpose is in fact to induce personal identity crises and make use of those to open up the possibilities for queer futures for the people that they do that with. But now we're talking about children in schools. So the goal that they have is to induce an identity crisis and make positive for them use of that crisis to drive their agenda to damage families, to damage faith, to damage our country, but more importantly to damage individuals who become the agents of change for that agenda. And this has gripped at the highest levels of our institutions. This has taken over virtually everything, as you are probably well aware. This is in the schools, as you've heard, but it's not just in the schools. It's the guidance directly coming from the U.S. Department of Education and its Office of Civil Rights, which was long before the Bostock decision making advances into claiming that gender identity and sexual orientation actually should be treated under Title IX provisions. So it's very legal. The Office of Civil Rights has been pushing that, and now they have the Bostock decision backing them up. The good Justice Gorsuch, who is not exactly one of the liberal justices, actually wrote the decision for Bostock explaining on very flawed logic that, in fact, the prosecutor in the case pointed out, giving away the story themselves is flawed logic, that if you discriminate based on transgender status or gender identity status at all, then that means you must have discriminated based on knowing the sex of the person somehow. This is completely flawed logic, and this means it's deeply embedded in our jurisprudence at the Supreme Court. We have this problem in virtually every medical association has taken this up. We have it from the American Psychiatric Association, which is about to publish a horrifying guide that will be used to try to derail the lawsuits against this. The American Psychological Association has been pushing it for years. You may remember a few years ago they published a document actually articulating that traditional masculinity should be treated as a mental disorder. This is a rampant ideological takeover, the American Medical Association. So we have it deeply in everything. We have this program in our schools called Comprehensive Sexuality Education, which you may or may not have heard of, that has replaced what was already controversial, which was sex education. Comprehensive sexuality education takes everything that used to be in sex ed, anatomy, physiology, safety, you know, the basics, the nuts and bolts, how does it work, the birds and the bees, as it were, and it adds in other pillars like sexual citizenship and pleasure-based sex education, which is now a huge push. I'm not joking. And where does comprehensive sexuality education, which is already mandated in some states and is spreading, where does that come from? The United Nations. UNESCO created the program in 2003 and has pushed it so widely. I had the pleasure of being in London recently, and I spoke with a man from Kenya who told me that it's in Kenya's schools. Not just America, not just Canada, not just Britain, Kenya. Well, what in the world do they have? Well, they're a UNESCO member state just like we are. President Trump took us out, by the way. President Biden put us back. So this is deep. This is a deep crisis. Now, I don't want to go on and on and on about how big this problem is and how we need to be digging into this, how we need to be looking. We all saw Bud Light, right, with the Dylan Mulvaney beer can thing. Ugh. We all saw that. Well, we didn't parlay that. We think we won. We didn't win. We didn't parlay that to the next step. The next step would have been to have congressional hearings asking them, why in the world did you do this? What was the role of the nonprofit organization called the Human Rights Campaign in setting up a corporate equality index that all these entities have to play by All these corporations have to play by. Why are all of our corporations doing this? Well, they're scored to do it. There are financial incentives and punishments if they don't do it. We need that exposed. But we also need to see the personal side of this. So I'm joined on the stage by many of the people in the documentary. We've got a couple of detransitioners here who are very brave young ladies, Laura Becker, Chloe Cole. This is the most important voice in America against this problem right now. Young women and some young men like these, Chloe, Laura, thank you. We've got a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, Joe Burgo, who works with these people in detransitioners and people going through gender confusion and other things in his practice. And we've got an everyday dad from California who's losing his son because this is also at the state of California level based off of all of that corruption that I opened up with for this crisis. And I want you to take home how personal all that administrative, bureaucratic, evil, academic nonsense. I want you to understand what the impact looks like in everyday lives. And so I think that queer theory represents the doctrine of a religious cult. I think it creates identity crises to move children into destruction. I think that because it's in their own words that I read and quote. And so I want to hear from you, Laura and Chloe, first about if that resonates with your experience. What has your experience been? Tell a little bit of your story. Since you're closer, Laura, you get to go first.
Everything that James just said is 100% true. I lived through the cult. I never thought that I would be indoctrinated. I never thought that I would be part of a fad. I was diagnosed with the autism spectrum when I was 11 years old. And I was also diagnosed with a hormonal disorder, polycystic ovary syndrome. I developed severe depression, anxiety, and I also had chronic abuse from a parent. I had undiagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder, and I was overall a very vulnerable and isolated child. And when I was in middle school, I found Tumblr. And on Tumblr, that's where all the misfits gathered. And Tumblr is also where the queer ideology spread. And by the time I was 15, I started identifying as genderqueer, as non-binary. And I started having symptoms of gender dysphoria, ruminating, obsessing about my female body and anatomy, and just overall feeling unlovable as a female. And eventually, when the suicide ideation became so pervasive that I felt hopeless, I turned to one of the only things that was presented as a solution to me, which was to medically and socially transition. And so at 18, I came out as a transgender male. 19, I was prescribed testosterone, which I injected weekly into my thigh. And at 20, I had a radical double mastectomy to remove my healthy breasts. And I was suicidal when I underwent those procedures. I had complex PTSD when I had those procedures, and I was brainwashed when I had those procedures. And so I absolutely agree that it is a cult. It is an existential, shallow solution to the spiritual void that we're all living through right now in this moment, but especially for young people. There was a spiritual void, there was an attachment void, a familial void, a sexual void. I was empty inside, and I was trying to fulfill myself by becoming a higher version of self that was actually a false version of self. And so absolutely, James, that I lived through the cult, and I'm very grateful to say that I've come out on the other side, and I'm so grateful to be with all of you today.
Look at that. All right, Chloe. I see you nodding, Chloe. Tell us your story.
Yes. I really feel like I resonate with what you, James, and especially with what you, Laura, said. I definitely had a lot of the same issues growing up. I had autism, but it went undiagnosed for years until I was an adult. Very much a creative type, definitely thought outside of the box. And I had been sexually traumatized. And none of that was really ever addressed in therapy. It was all very much made about my gender, my sex, the way that I was born being the issue rather than these experiences that I'd had in my life. I feel like because we were born at different times, I just so happened to be growing up in the time when they started changing the standards of care and allowing children younger and younger to go through this. So I was a kid when I started transitioning, both socially and medically. I started to feel dysphoric at about 12 years old, after having an early puberty at 9 years old. That early development, it made me feel like I was being treated and seen as an adult while I still had the mind and body of a child. It was incredibly difficult to deal with. I was afraid of the responsibility of becoming a woman, of the possibility of becoming a mother, of how people might take advantage of me, my femininity. And there were times when I felt as though I would be happier. I would be a better person if I were born male, if I were a boy. And I started to actually believe that I was a boy once I was introduced to the transgender community online. And after I came out to my mom and dad, which I did through a letter, they wanted to be supportive of me, but they were also very cautious. And so they started sending me to therapy because they didn't feel like, because they didn't really understand the subject very much at the time, it was very novel to them that they would need further help in raising me through this. They didn't really expect that by seeing a psychologist, I would just be funneled further and further into this pipeline, rather than them going deeper into my issues, trying to figure out where these feelings were coming from. I was only really affirmed in the idea that I was made wrong, that I had to fix myself, that in order to self-actualize, I'd have to be reliant on medication for the rest of my life. And so at 13 years old, I was placed on Lupron as a puberty suppressant. I was put on testosterone to replace my natural female hormones. And at 15 years old, when I was just a sophomore in high school, that was when they removed my breasts surgically. And I stopped transitioning less than a year later, because I realized that I was, in fact, a very feminine woman, that I wanted to embrace my femininity, that I had a maternal instinct, that I wanted to become a mother, and that by transitioning, I was losing parts of my identity, not gaining. I was losing parts of my adulthood, of myself as a woman. And if I kept living in this fantasy of transition, I never would fully grow up. It was a tough journey back. I lost all my support from my doctors, from the transgender community. But I made it back. And I mean, I'm just so incredibly thankful for the support that I've had from my family during this time, from all of you. And since I was 17 years old, I've been speaking out about my experience, using the pain that my family and I went through to try and help the other children, the other men and women and families whose lives are being destroyed by this.
So proud and happy to be sitting up here seeing you all stand up and cheer for these detransitioners. It's such a big thing. It is so important, and I'm so glad to see the support. It makes me very proud to have come to Turning Point this year. Actually, this moment does. I want to turn to you, Joe. You're a clinical psychologist. You treat people in similar conditions to what the ladies have explained. Do you care to explain a little of what you're hearing from them, how common that is in your practice, and maybe some of the changes that your profession has undergone in the last few years?
Right. So the stories that I'm hearing today are very familiar to me from the perspective of the detransitioners I work with in my practice. Feeling of isolation, being a misfit, having undiagnosed medical problems, deep feelings of shame about themselves, as if there's something wrong with them. And then they encounter this ideology that says, oh, that's because you're trans, and this will be the answer to all your difficulties. In my profession, it's called diagnostic overshadowing. It's because the minute gender enters into the picture, everything else goes by the wayside. It's understood that all of these other issues are a result of gender dysphoria and will be cured by transition. Of course, it's a complete fiction. And then when young people like Chloe and Laura figure it out, then they have to deal with all those mental health issues that weren't addressed before transition. Plus, they've got the incredible trauma and shame of having gone through transition, being attacked by the community that used to support them. It's a really horrible situation for these young people. The other part of my practice that I see is I see young people who are sent to me by their parents. They're trans-identified, and they're struggling with these issues. And the problem for me as a therapist in working with them is that I can't say exactly what I think is true because I've got a licensing board and a profession who is telling me that if I don't affirm these trans identities, then I'm committing malpractice, and they could come after my license. So it's like practicing with one arm tied behind your back. It's very frustrating work because you can't just come out and say, it's impossible for you to change sexes and this is a cult that you've fallen into. You can never say that. And finally, the other part of my practice that I deal with is I consult with those parents. And this is the hardest part. I've been through it myself personally with my own daughter, but this feeling of...
In that time, I was completely taken away from my son. The judge out of California gave me only 2 FaceTime conversations a week with my son. I've had to go through, in that time, I was completely taken away from my son. The judge out of California gave me only 2 FaceTime conversations a week with my son. I've had to go through anger management. I've had to go through parenting classes. They weren't even called parenting classes. They were called child abuse classes. So I was sitting in a group full of parents that actually did abuse their child, and I'm sitting there thinking to myself, why am I here? I have done nothing to my son. And it has now spiraled completely out of control. They have removed me of all my father's rights, my parental rights. The judge ordered a gender assessment to be done on my son. I requested to sit in on this assessment. They denied me that. I had hired my own child therapist not to sway left or right, but to sit in on the assessment just to figure out how they're going to get to each step. And in my son's case, they didn't treat my son A, B, C, D, and all the way up. They went from A to Z with my son. I requested to have a phone conversation with the doctor, and I was denied that. The last 4 years has been one-sided. Not one time has opposing counsel, minors counsel, or the judges sat me down and asked me, the father, what I think is going on with my son. And now they refer to my son as my daughter in court. My son now has she, her pronouns, and my son now goes by a girl's name. His mother sent a letter to the school basically stating that at 4 years old at the time, that my son Aiden is now full transgender and that he is ready to come out, or she is ready, I hate to say that, sorry, but she is ready to come out and meet the world. And if you have any questions, I have books and information to share with you. And that was in the email that a parent had sent me. I would never have known about this email if it wasn't for the parent. And I'm going on 4 Christmases without my son. We are now in the middle of trying to file an appeal with the state of California to try to slow down this, in my situation, this child abuse. Anytime I bring up the child abuse, the doctors or the police department or anything like that, they tell me I'm crazy and that I need to go see a therapist for making these false accusations against the attorneys, the judge, and my mother, and my son's mother. So it's been a nightmare 4 years, and it's still not over yet because now I'm the judge. Another judge in California has granted a 5-year restraining order against me. So that'll put me 8 years without my son, and at 10, that's when I'm understanding that they can start my son on the medications.
It's horrifying. It's horrifying. It's a horrifying story. Thank you, Adam, for your courage in telling it in a crowd like this.
Thank you.
Well, we've only got a few minutes left, but I want to kind of create an arc toward what people think what each of you think we might be able to do about some of this. But I just want to point out that what we see here is that we see young people who are struggling, who then go for help, and what they end up with is, was it therapeutic overshadowing? Is that what you call it? That turns into state overshadowing, which is also called tyranny. And this is the situation that this identity crisis faces here in America. And before I switch to solutions, we might go a little over. Sorry, guys. I want to ask one question of you, Laura, because last night we talked about this, and you said something that stuck out to me, and you got to be really brief, but that this experience you had turned into a channel to bring you into radical activism. And if you could just a few remarks on that, just so people can hear that there's, why is this happening? Well, we create radical activists out of people if we do this.
Teenagers are always rebelling. That's their default and natural state. That's developmentally healthy. But what we're seeing today is an increase in academia, K-12 education, and media pushing young people to become radicalized so that they can become fighters for far leftist causes, communism, and, authoritarian sorts of measures where there's censorship of speech and expression and thought. And that's what happened to me. I was on Tumblr. I was learning about feminism. I was learning about racism. I was very interested in understanding these abstract intellectual ideas. And I thought that I was, learning this, brand new, awakening, awareness, all of this. I thought I was becoming transcendent. In reality, I was actually reading postmodernist theory, as James has illustrated frequently. It's drivel, it's nonsense, it's grooming, and it's lies. More than anything, it's manipulation, it's lies. And young people like me and Chloe fall into this, thinking that we are becoming avant-garde or artistic or creative when it's really suppressing truth. And if you're suppressing truth, you can never actually be authentic in reality.
All right, Adam. You're a dad.
Yes, sir.
What do we need to do? What do parents need to do?
Like I say in a lot of my videos, and I'm just speaking from the California side of all of this, I tell people you need to hold on to your kids extra tight. You really do, especially in the state of California. That's the biggest thing that I miss is holding my son. And I never heard "I love you" from my father until I was late in my age, but something told me deep down inside to make sure I told my son I loved him every single time I had him. And I think parents in California really need to stand up to what is going on in the state of California, because even though it happened from within the home, on my side, it's happening in the school districts, and I'm seeing it firsthand, just firsthand on what they're doing in California.
And stand up for this ballot initiative in California, right?
Yeah, we've got a ballot initiative from Aaron Friday. It's Protect Kids 2020. So on that initiative, one of them is continuing the parental rights, keep the parental rights strong, to notify the parents in the schools. The second one is to keep boys out of girls' sports. And the second one is to stop the medications, the surgeries, or gender-affirming care on minors.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, Joe, what do psychologists need to be doing? What do we need to do for our professionals?
Well, I naively thought when I moved into this space as a therapist that I could make a difference, and I do individually, especially for people who have detransitioned and moved out of the ideology. But I increasingly think that it's almost impossible for us to do our profession when the rest of the world is allied against us, when it's in the schools, when it's in the medical schools, medical profession, it's in the administration, it is everywhere. So to me, the answer is political.
I agree. Thank you. Thank you. All right, Chloe, bring us home. Do the last word.
Fight like hell. Starting in our communities. Don't think for a second that this is just a California issue. Because this is happening in every community, in every single city, in every single state in the U.S., everywhere in the West. It's infected our families. It's torn apart children from their mothers, their fathers, their caretakers, from the people who love them and know them best. It's infected our institutions, namely healthcare and education. You might feel afraid of the consequences of speaking out. The backlash can be brutal. But while you might lose your friends, you may lose your job, you can and you will gain so much more by living and speaking truthfully. We cannot ignore what is going on. These irresponsible, evil adults must be held accountable.